And he said, Jeff, I have to confess something to you. He said, when you gave your pitch, and I said to you, well, let me think about it, see if it's a good fit. What was on the other side of that is, there's no way in heck I would ever work with somebody like you. You're a mega church pastor in Dallas, Texas. You're part of the problem. And he said, the word I would use is immoral. It would be immoral for me to work with you.
Oh, wow.
Because you're the kind of person that makes our world worse, not better. And he said, I know how to give influence to people. And if I give influence to the wrong people, I make the world worse. I can't live with myself. And he said, but I was unfair. And he said, I knew Mike was involved. I respect Mike. So we vetted your organization and we listened to what you said, what you say to your people in sermons. More importantly, we looked at what you actually do in the community. And when we did, we realized you're not who we thought you were. And we had no idea there was a version of Christianity like you that exists in the world. And I believe I've got to help you, because the world needs to know there's a version of Christianity like you.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. So glad you joined us. Hey, if it's your first time here, make sure you subscribe, because we drop a lot of great episodes. And today we're going to talk about rebranding Christianity. Let's face it, it needs more than a rebrand. I think we probably need some deep soul work. And I'm going to sit down with marketing expert and pastor Jeff Jones to talk about just that. I think you're going to love it. And here's a question for you. Are you texting the members of your church? Do you know that you get a 4x open rate on text versus email? About 25% for email, 98% for text messages. And I know you're thinking, well, that's a big drain. Like, I got to write them. Well, CHURCH.TECH will do the writing for you. What if you could automate it, but make it really personal? Check it out. Go to CHURCH.TECH/texting, click on the link and check that out. And then 10 by 10 is doing some amazing things. I don't know a single youth pastor or senior leader who doesn't want to reach more young people. And they have, in this huge multi-denominational, multi-ethnic, multi-geographic initiative of 10 by 10, they've got free resources for you and your church. So you can check it out at 10by10.org. And now to my conversation with Jeff Jones. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Carey. I so appreciate your input into the lives of leaders like myself. It's a real treat to be able to be with you.
Well, we're all trying to figure it out together, aren't we?
We are.
That's the way it goes. And I certainly don't have all the answers, which is one of the reasons I love in this format being the question asker. So thanks for your contribution to the dialogue too. I want to start sort of broadly. How did you come up with the idea that Christianity needs a rebrand?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, mainly as a Christian with a lot of friends who are not Christians, and I work hard to maintain that. And I'm from a non-church family, just realizing that, and the perception of Christianity over the last few years, seeing it tanking, and then trying to run a church too that is trying to reach people who don't go to church, and feeling more like, back in the day, if you remember Moonies, in the airports.
Yeah.
And they would hand out their stuff and all that. And they were so, to most of us, kind of repulsive and weird that you're like, I don't care how good your stuff is. I'm not interested. And realizing that over the decades, that's where we are as Christianity and culture is we're like that. We're repulsive. And so I realized, man, we've got a big problem. We're not perceived the way Jesus said that we should be perceived. We're perceived as the opposite of that. He gave us the responsibility. So it's happening on my watch. Let's take it seriously.
How do you said something in passing that I think is significant. How do you work to make sure that you have lots of non-Christian friends? Because I think that's an occupational hazard and one that I have to continually struggle to make sure that I've got at least a handful of people in my life that don't go to church, don't know Jesus, and that I'm building into. And it's just hard, man, because as my friend Reggie Joyner says, non-Christians never call you. Christians call you all day long, right? Particularly if you lead a church. What do you do to make sure that you have got friendships outside the church?
It is so difficult. So for me, I fortunately have a couple of non-church friends who are super magnetic, who just have a lot of friends. And so they've sort of introduced me into their world in a way that, and through sports. I'm a golfer. I'm a skier. And so being part of the club and and golfing, or my Colorado friends and skiing, especially my Colorado friends, are the most helpful because they don't understand that I am a pastor of a church like Chase Oaks. And they have no concept that it even exists. And so, like, one of those guys, when I was in Colorado writing the book, and we went to dinner, and he said, "Hey, what are you writing about? I hear you're writing a book." And so I told him, Rebranding Christianity and the perception of Christianity. And he said, "Well, what is the brand of Christianity?" And I said, "Well, Jesus gave it to us. He said, this is how people know you're my followers, if you love the way I've loved." So the way we should be perceived is, oh, wow, those are the people that love in extraordinary ways that you can't even explain. Radical love. And he said, "Holy expletive.
Yeah.
That's your brand?" And I said, "Well, yeah, that's our brand."
Theoretically.
Yeah. And he said, "Wow." He said, "You better write a book." He said, "There's nobody outside your little circle that would ever perceive you that way. You realize that, right?" And I was like, yeah, I do. That's why, that's the problem. That's what we're talking about. And so, and it's been interesting because it's been those friends and non-church people that I've talked to have actually been most enthusiastic about the book project. And it's drawn them into the conversation. I think it's kind of like, hey, we know you stink. We didn't know you stink. And that's interesting to us. And so that's been a surprise to me. It's pulled them into the conversation about Christianity.
How do you make sure that those relationships don't become or get perceived to be projects? Because you've seen that too, right? Like, oh yeah, I'm going to go out and build a few non-Christian friendships and we'll get them all baptized. People can smell that. And even if they can't smell it, I don't know that that's right. What do you do to make sure that that isn't the approach?
I think you're right. I mean, people can smell that. And I grew up in a non-church home. So that's it's kind of my people. So to me, it feels pretty natural to relate in that world because that's the world that I came from. And certainly, like, my brother, who is in heaven now, he died of cancer just a few years ago. He was the least likely person I would ever consider that would ever come to know Christ, And it was just over time, a lot of time and a lot of patience. And so I think I think just loving people with time and patience and no agenda, that's what I try to do.
Yeah. So what does that look like?
Yeah. So, like for this friend that I mentioned, his name is Kenton, and I really let him drive the spiritual part of the conversation. I don't, and literally he knows that I'm a pastor, but he has no idea what that means. But the Holy Spirit's pretty good about doing what he does. And and I don't feel like I have to force that conversation. I don't, it comes up naturally. And so I really let him, maybe my agenda is just to be a friend and to love him. And when I see things going on in his life, he's a very wealthy person who has a very empty life. And so he might say, "Hey, you've got your religion. For me, I prefer to drink." And I'll say, "Well, okay, that's good. I like drinking too sometimes, but how's that working for you?" Or, And his life motto, for example, is, "I don't know what I want to do, but I know I want to do whatever I want to do." And I'll say, that's a fun motto, but, how's it working,
Yeah.
And it'd be like, well, not so great,
Huh. Okay. Anything else on that advice? What about church leaders in particular, I'm thinking, who are caught up in that bubble? And I get it. I mean, there are organizational pressures that just force you into that. Everyone I know says they're a Christian, but who want to break out of that mold. What are some tips or advice that you would have for them?
Well, I think mainly you've got to see it as job one. Because I think maybe one of the biggest problems with Christianity and culture right now is bubble people. And so we live in self-reinforcing bubbles in a world of tribalism. And therefore, we just lose sight of the people we're called to reach. And in an us versus them world, we have to model for people that we lead that we can't live in an us versus them world. We're an us for them world, and we're all them. And so for me, I've come to see it as job one. Like I can't imagine anything more important than me right now in our culture modeling what it's like to live out of the bubble and to have broad relationships. And therefore, it just takes a lot of time and margin and priority to do it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what stage of life you're at, but I found my kids are in their 30s and 20s now. And when we became empty nesters, it got 10x harder. When they were little,
yeah.
I mean, we were around unchurched people all the time because you're at all the school stuff, all the sports, everything like that. Yeah. And now if I'm not intentional, honestly, it doesn't happen, particularly as I've gotten a little more reclusive as I've gotten older.
Yeah,
too,
no,
right?
That's true. So I grew up playing hockey. You're Canadian, but and my kids played hockey. So I coached hockey. So being in the hockey world in Dallas, I kind of became the Christian in the hockey world around here, the pastor of the hockey world. And but that meant carving out that time I didn't have time to coach a hockey team. But again, if job one is getting out of that bubble, then do it. And so, and as I'm an empty nester now, and it is harder. So for me, sports are the gateway to do that.
Yeah. Or some kind of shared interest or hobby,
right.
Something that will get you outside of the mold, which can be really good. All right. Well, I want to talk about rebranding. Let me speak on behalf of some of the audience and push back a little bit. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
I know you can take it, Jeff.
Yeah.
The idea of branding is definitely the currency of our congregation. But I mean, I hear from these people all the time who are like, hey man, no branding, no strategy is needed. We have the ethic of love, the outward thrust of the gospel, the message of Jesus. That all created the momentum we need to grow. We don't even have to think about branding. Like, why would you ever brand something like Christianity? What do you say to people who, I'm sure you've heard that, have that kind of objection?
Yeah, I think when you first hear rebranding Christianity, what some people have thought is what we're talking about is some slick marketing campaign, that, hey, this 2,000-year-old brand, it may have worked back in Jesus's day, but that doesn't work anymore. We got to get some consultants and come up with something new and have this. And we're actually saying the opposite. What we're saying is, hey, Jesus gave us our brand 2,000 years ago. This is how people will know you're my followers. He gave us that brand and that responsibility. And we've drifted from that brand in all kinds of ways so that nobody outside of our bubble thinks of us. I think what my friend said is right, thinks of us according to the brand. So what we're talking about is not being less of who Jesus called us to be, but much more who Jesus called us to be. And he gave us the responsibility of how we should be known. I mean, it's on us. And that's all a brand is, right? Is how we're known and the implicit promises that come with it. And every person, every organization has a brand, whether we know it or not. Like you. Like if I found out, if somebody told me, I listened to Carey Nieuwhof the other day, a podcast, and he said this, and if it was uncharacteristic, if it was against your brand, I'd be like, I don't think so. I've come to trust Carey. I know what he stands for. I don't think there's any way that he said that. I'm going to listen because there's no way he said that, right? Because you have a brand. And every organization, every individual has that. It's not some slick thing. It's just how we're known and the implicit expectations and promises that come with that. And I believe Jesus gave us the responsibility. Well, I know Jesus gave us the responsibility. Hey, here's how you're going to be known. And that's all I mean. And so, yeah, if you talk about, hey, man, the early Christians didn't need all that. And they just lived an ethic of love and diversity and sacrifice and all of that, to say, yeah, because they were on brand. And that brand proved to be an irresistible force for good.
So the argument is we're kind of off brand, in other words.
Way off brand. Yeah.
So, and I think that's a really good point. It's like people who are like, yeah, we don't have any cultural values. It's like, yeah, but you have a culture, right? So what you're arguing is that your brand is basically how you're perceived.
Yes.
In the same way that you perceive Tesla differently from, say, Nike or differently than Chevrolet. Every brand sort of has a persona. And whether you think about it intentionally or not, you definitely have a brand. And that's something, I mean, we have branding in my company, but we think a lot about what we say, how we say it. because it's just such a polarized and charged environment. It's not like we're afraid. It's just like, oh, I want to wade into the conversation, but if I say this, it's going to trigger all the explosions on this side. If I say that, it's going to trigger all these explosions on that side. Why don't we try to go a different way? So your argument would be, just to confirm, everybody has a brand?
Everybody has a brand, and Jesus gave us the brand and the responsibility to manage it. And the apostles do too, So Paul said, hey, live in a way that your daily life wins the respect of outsiders, or, relate in such a way that people who have something bad to say about you will be ashamed that they ever even thought that way, And there's a lot in the New Testament of engaging culture in a compelling way that has every opportunity to create pull toward Jesus and to create curiosity rather than repulsion. And so, brand is, maybe you could call it an analogy. It's a modern way of saying that same thing, but that's all we're saying. And I knew that rebranding would be provocative, which is why we chose why we chose it, to get people to kind of say, wait a minute, we don't need that. And you think, no, actually we do.
So Christians, and I know you know this, in the West, in America in particular, are seen as, and here's a partial list, judgmental, hypocritical, partisan, homophobic, spiteful, sexist, and in some cases corrupt, right? Like not trustworthy, not to mention hateful. So you acknowledge that. And in many cases, the critics aren't wrong, right? Like that's actually honest about some elements of the Christian tribe. So is this a question of rebranding, or is this really a question of repentance? Like really, like get on our faces and like, oh, how did we become this way? Why have we missed the mark? Like what's at the heart of that?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think it is about rebranding, and part of rebranding is about repenting. And that's what I've seen. I wrote this book with two marketing experts, one who ran marketing for Frito-Lay and GameStop and other companies, another considered one of the top 1, 2, or 3 branding experts in the world, who happens to be not a Christian and a nun, by the way. So that was fascinating, part of it. And they did the case studies throughout the book, and it was great to write with them. But it's really interesting because when they talk about branding, I tend to think about it cheaply, that it's just about the marketing campaign or something like that. But to them,
we need a new graphic, new logo, new color. Right.
But to them, it runs really deep. And so they would understand, even the non-believing Dwight would understand repentance and talk about it that way. Like to say, hey, if a good organization has a strong brand, which means that they understand who they are and what they offer and what their implicit promise is. And a good brand, if they're off brand, will repent. We'll have frank honesty and say, you know what, we are off brand. We are not who we are supposed to be, who we want to be. We've let you down. We're sorry, and we're going to fix it. And every good brand would do that, according to Dwight.
So I want to come back to that. I want to put a pin in that and talk about how brands actually do that, like popular brands that we would know.
Yeah.
One more objection as I was working through the material, getting ready for this, is because I've heard it said, and I'm sure you've heard it said, that often the church, it's not that we're bad, we're just misunderstood, or the media is so biased, or everything is just so skewed, but we're really good people. We just have a bad rap. And I've heard that.
Oh, yeah.
What's your response to that?
Yeah, and that's going to happen. We're going to be treated unfairly in culture. We can't control that. I mean, as a pastor, you are a pastor, I'm a pastor. Anytime I watch a movie that's not a Hallmark movie or some Christian movie, and a pastor comes on, I'm thinking, oh boy, here we go.
Exactly.
Going to be a pedophile, going to be a hypocrite, going to be something terrible, right? And you think, oh, that's not fair. And so that's going to happen. I can't control that. But what Jesus gave us a responsibility to do, I can control. And that is to represent the brand well, to represent Jesus the way he called us to represent it. And if we have a brand problem, I don't believe he gave us the option to just play the victim card, because we have the responsibility. This is how you'll be known. Like, it's on us. It's our responsibility. If you think about it, if we were really living the way that we were called to live, and that somebody's watching that movie in culture and sees a pastor like that, and then what would happen over time is say, that's just stupid. Pastors aren't like that. Christians aren't like. I know Christians. I know pastors. They're amazing people. It's such an unrealistic movie, right? But that's not where we're at, right? People say, "Oh yeah," because they've had those experiences. And so, a lot of Christians are playing the victim card right now, but I don't, but Jesus gives us the responsibility, and the New Testament gives us the responsibility to manage the brand. I like what Peter said to the Christians in Rome who were facing this onslaught of malicious, PR from the Roman Empire. And he said, "Hey, look, if you're suffering for doing what's good, well, rejoice, if you're being treated unfairly, God will reward you. And, that's great. But if you suffer for doing wrong, shame on you." And so I think for us, hey, that's unfair stuff's going to happen. But if we're being misunderstood and maligned and bad things are being said about us because we're actually contributing to the vitriol, we're not who we're called to be, then shame on us. And I think that's what we have to focus on.
So from a PR perspective, and I want to analyze it through that lens, what is wrong with playing the victim card? What does that do for you in the public eye when a brand claims to be misrepresented, unfairly treated? We see politicians play the victim card.
Yeah.
We see brands sometimes play it. And I definitely would agree with you that a lot of Christians are playing the, "Oh, we're being persecuted. Oh, we're victims" card. What does that do to someone when they play the victim card?
Yeah, well, it certainly contributes to the us versus them narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so disempowering, right? You're essentially, and so I think people respect authenticity. Well, I know people respect authenticity. They respect, hey, we're not who we're called to be. I think most people, unless they're already in that group, disrespect victims. People who play the victim card, and if you're in the group,
true. Let me make a distinction. We're not talking about real victims here.
Right.
We're talking about people who claim victims because they don't like the way the narrative is playing out.
And so people who are not in your group can see through that. And you become a joke. Now, in your group, it actually solidifies this, it ferments the fear and all that kind of stuff. So in the little bubble, it's actually, unfortunately, effective at reinforcing, hey, we're mistreated, we've got to fight these outside forces and all of that. But outside the bubble, we're just seen as ridiculous. And and I think that's what's happening in Christianity too, as we, because if you're in the Christian bubble, the rebranding Christianity thing makes no sense. Because you think, man, no, we're good. I mean, we're great, and it's just this outside world, and they're the mean ones, and they're out to get us, and all that. And that's why I think it's so important to live outside the bubble, so that we can see ourselves not just through a self-reinforcing, "You're awesome," but we can actually see ourselves for who we are and how we're perceived.
So I want to dig into some of the marketing stuff that you and your co-authors cover. Can you explain Net Promoter Score? I think it's something we've all heard about, we're vaguely aware of, and we think we understand, but I don't think I understand it. What is Net Promoter Score?
Yeah, so the Net Promoter Score has become kind of the gold standard of measuring for companies how they're doing in terms of customer perception and loyalty. And it started back in 2003 with a consultant from Bain who wrote a Harvard Business Review article, and then it became, it got out there. And essentially, it has a scale from minus 100 to 100. Anything above 0 is considered good. Anything above 50 is considered stellar. But it's very simple. And all they do is say, okay, all they do is ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, would you recommend this service or this product or this organization to a friend or colleague? On a scale of 1 to 10.
So that's one question? One question for the Net Promoter Score? Okay.
And so 1, if you give a 1, you're saying, I would never recommend that in a million years. And 10 is, man, I recommend it all the time. I'm an evangelist. I'm just this crazy evangelist about this product. Okay, so from 1 to 10. And the way it works is there's 3 categories of people that come out of that. So 9 and 10 are promoters. So those are the ones that are motivated enough, they love you enough that they're telling their friends about it, and they're the evangelists. They're, spreading growing your influence. That's 9s and 10s. 7s and 8s are called passives. So they're people who love it, like they love the podcast. They're just not, they don't love it enough to tell other people about it.
Or to share it.
Or to share it. So they're not hurting you, but they're not helping you. They're passives. And then 0 to 6 are detractors. Those are people that don't like you, and they're very willing to share that with other people, because what he found, which I think we all know is true, is negative news spreads a whole lot faster than positive, right? So people are very motivated to share negative experiences much more than positive experiences, which is why it's so tilted, because the only ones that count positive are 9s and 10s. 0 to 6s count negative. So what you do is you total up your 9s and 10s, and then you subtract all your 0s to 6s, and that's your score. And so companies like Comcast are very negative, and you can imagine why, right?
Yeah.
We'll be there from 4 to 6 sometime in the next 10 days.
So let me just back up for a second. You're saying 0 to 6 becomes a negative.
Yes.
So you subtract it. Okay.
You subtract it, yeah.
So that's how you get to negative 100.
Which is why it's so hard to be positive, right? Why, because 0 to 6, all those people, and only the 9s and 10s are positive. So that's why anything above a 0 is significant.
I want to continue, but I want to break that down. I can see a lot of church leaders going, if they got a 5 or a 6, it's like, no, these people are basically happy. Like, they're okay. They're not, it's not like they're all right. It's like moderately satisfied, not extremely satisfied. Why in marketing language is that a negative?
Yeah, because they're not passives, because again, negative people are more motivated to share negative than positive.
Yeah. And
so that's why 5s and 6s are still motivated enough, not like a 1. They're not out to burn you down. But they're still, so let's say in Christianity, they've had enough negative experiences with Christians that when somebody says, oh, I'm dating a Christian, or a neighbor moved in next door and they're a Christian, they may not be, as ruthless as a 0 or a 1, but they'll still, as a 5 or 6, basically say, oh no, man, I'm sorry. Or why are you dating? You're dating a Christian? Why are you dating that? So they may not be as strongly negative, but they're still negative, again, because negative gets passed on a lot more than positive.
Okay, super helpful. So if a church or an organization wanted to calculate its net promoter score, I'm sure there are ways to skew the results. And there's this thing I call pastor math, which is we always like the best numbers, the exaggerated numbers. How do you get an accurate net promoter score for your church, business, or organization?
Yeah, I think you'd really have to ask.
Yeah.
I do. I don't think you could just make it up.
Can't just do like a Instagram poll and say, here's our net promoter score.
Right. I think, and so we've done some surveys from time to time in culture, so we'll go, back in the day, I remember one we did that we went to a mall and gave free food, just at a restaurant in a mall, and say, hey, we'll give you, people who are coming to the restaurant, will buy your meal if you answer some questions, But I think you'd really have to do a real survey where you're asking real people. I'm sure you could do it somehow through social media, but that'd be tough. And so there are agencies that will help you do that to find out where you're really at. But you can imagine, I mean, if I know people like Dwight and Mike that wrote the book with me, they would say, you really don't have to work that hard to guess where Christianity's at, because all you have to do is look at all the polling data that's out there in terms of the perception of Christianity. And it's not encouraging, and and it's going, and it's gone so quickly, and like Gallup did a study of the youngest generation of adults in 2001. It would be Gen Z now, but back then it was probably, busters or something. I don't know.
Sure.
Of just your perception of Christianity, positive or negative. And 60-something% were positive, even more than were Christians. So that was, they did the same study in 2021, and only 37% of people in that age group had a positive view of Christianity, felt like it was a positive force for good in the world, which meant, 63% believed we're a negative force for good in the world. Wow. Well, that's a massive shift of perception, and that in 20 years. And so you look at that and think, oh, wow, we've got a big problem. I mean, we certainly have a significantly negative net promoter score. So how do you turn detractors into promoters?
Has anybody attempted to calculate a net promoter score for the church? I forget whether that was in your book or not.
Yeah, it's not, and I would love that to happen. You just had Dave Kinnaman on not too long ago.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. So let's reach out to Dave and say, hey, let's try to do that. I think I know what the answer is. My guess, I think I know, but
a little depressing.
Yeah, but it'd be really good to see it.
It'd be negative. How did you connect with your co-authors, the professional marketers, particularly the non-Christian?
Yeah, that's a fascinating story, actually. So Mike, who is the Christian, is on. I always like to have on our executive team as a church what I call an outsider insider, which means somebody who's in our church but not employed by our church, who's a really great leader, who's not going to say, well, we've always done it this way, or, somebody who's willing to be objective and ask really hard questions. And so Mike has been that person over the last 20 years. And he, ran marketing for Frito-Lay, super smart guy, super helpful, incredible strategist. So, Mike, I've known for a long time. And he's the one that connected me with Dwight Jewson, who Mike considers the top, 1, 2, or 3 branding experts in the country. And he's worked with when organizations have branding trouble, like whether it's Johnson & Johnson or the government or whoever, he's one of the people that you go to. He's helped run political campaigns of, which is in Obama or, different campaigns. He's on that side of things. And so he's just a well-respected person, but a very skeptical, not Christian. So years ago, this was like 20 years ago, I saw what was happening in our own community as a church built around reaching people who don't go to church, seeing the decline of perception of Christianity of the people we're trying to reach. And so I asked Mike, hey, how could we get, 2 or 3 layers outside of Christianity, just in our own community, a more positive view of Christianity, expose people to a more genuine view of Christianity, a more authentic, what I would consider Christianity, than they're experiencing? And how can we change the perception of Christianity?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, hey, I'm going to bring a friend of mine, Dwight Jewson, to come in. He's the best person in the world to answer that question and just see if he'll work with us. So he flew down. Dwight lives in Seattle, flew down to Dallas, took us to a really nice restaurant. I lay out what I'm asking him to do. Would he do? I can't pay him. He's way too expensive for my church budget. But would he do this pro bono? And he just said, I'll consider that. Thank you. I sure respect Mike more than as much as any human being on the planet. And I know he's involved in your church, but let me just think about it, see if it's a good. So it was very cold. Well, then a couple months later, he called and said, hey, I'm going to fly to Dallas and I want to take you out to dinner. And he was very enthusiastic, very animated. And that conversation was so different. And he said, Jeff, I have to confess something to you. He said, when you gave your pitch, and I said to you, well, let me think about it, see if it's a good fit. What was on the other side of that is, there's no way in heck I would ever work with somebody like you. You're a megachurch pastor in Dallas, Texas. You're part of the problem. And he said, the word I would use is immoral. It would be immoral for me to work with you.
Oh, wow.
Because you're the kind of person that makes our world worse, not better. And he said, I know how to give influence to people. And if I give influence to the wrong people, I make the world worse. I can't live with myself. And he said, but I was unfair. And he said, I knew Mike was involved. I respect Mike. So we vetted your organization and we listened to what you said, what you say to your people in sermons. More importantly, we looked at what you actually do in the community. And when we did, we realized you're not who we thought you were. And we had no idea there was a version of Christianity like you that exists in the world. And I believe I've got to help you because the world needs to know there's a version of Christianity like you that is not what they think in the best sense of that word. And one of the sermons he had heard was a sermon I had done, and we actually talked about it in that conversation, about the stewardship of power and how God always gives power, not for the powerful, but for the powerless. And I was just getting people in the church to think about all the influence, all the power you have. It's not for you. It's to lift up the powerless. And how are we doing that? And he said, Jeff, I still to this day talk to my, blue friends in my blue states about there's a church in Dallas, Texas, having this kind of conversation with their church, a conservative church, and they think I'm lying. And so anyway, he's the most enthusiastic. He's in fact, he's the one that told me to write the book. And
really?
And he's also the one who, he just said, why are we thinking just locally? Why don't we think nationally? Why don't we rebrand Christianity in America? Why think about Dallas? I mean, you can, but why do that? And because he does national, campaigns and that kind of just the way he thinks. And so he was really the biggest motivation for the book.
Wow, that's a really cool story. One of the challenges we have, I'm getting ahead of myself. I do want to go there, but let's talk marketing a little bit more, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So you got two leading national experts on marketing helping you with the book, but probably even more importantly, helping you think through the whole problem that your church and the church is facing. One of the case studies you outline with your co-authors, Mike and Dwight, is the case of Dominos. So do you want to take us through that? It's a really interesting analogy. And if you have at least a 15-year memory, you might remember this.
Yeah, fascinating one. So in the early 2000s, or actually late 2000s, Domino's had a massive problem. Their market share was way down. Their stock price was way down. They were known for fast pizza, 30 minutes or less, but terrible pizza. And so their customers would say, all these terrible things, and they got all this bad feedback. And what they could have done is denied it. They could have said, no, the people are being unfair. We actually have great pizza. But they chose not to do that. Instead, they chose to take ownership. So I think they're a great example of where we're at. So what they decided to do was choose a path of ruthless honesty. And so their marketing campaign is they hired real, not actors, but real customers to just say honest things about their pizza. And if you may remember these ads, and they just put them out there. So people would say things like, Domino's Pizza is worse than the cardboard box it comes in. And that's their marketing campaign, And then they said, hey, we get it, but no more. We've gone back to the drawing board. We've changed everything. We've changed our whole approach to pizza. And we know you don't trust us enough to buy one, so we're going to give you one. And they did. They gave out, I don't know how, I have no idea how many pizzas they gave away. But it's an incredible story because, they actually did change their product and improve their whole product. But they didn't just do new improved and stamp that on it because they knew they didn't have enough trust to do that. But they chose a path of ruthless honesty. They gave their pizza away. And from 2010 to 2020, they more than doubled their market share. And their stock price went from about $3 to over $300, which outpaced companies like Google, Amazon, Apple in that same time period, which is one of the best turnaround stories in branding history. But the way they did it was not slick marketing, not slick campaign, not new improved, trust us. just ruthless honesty. Our pizza stinks and we know it, but no more. That's not who we're going to be anymore. And I think that's where I think that's where we are. As we've had so much mission drift toward politicization of the church and vitriol and culture wars and all the ways
tribalization.
All the ways we've gotten sidetracked to say, that's not who Jesus called us to be. And we're sorry. I was just in a meeting with the World Evangelical Alliance, pulled all these national leaders together to talk about the word evangelical and can it be saved in our culture.
Interesting.
And one thing that was interesting is one of the leaders of the WEA, who's from another culture, said, "Hey, just so you know, this is an American conversation, because in most parts of the world, evangelical is actually a positive thing. They're just people who do nice things, wonderful things for people in sacrificial ways. In America, you've ruined it with all these ways you've gotten sidetracked. So just know you're not speaking for the world, but you're speaking for America." So that kind of was an eye opener. But as we talked about it, one of the people there, his name is Darrell Bach, who leads the Center for Christian Leadership at Dallas Seminary. But he just said, I think at the beginning where we have to realize where we are is we need to apologize to our culture. That, he gets us, and campaigns like that are great, and they show how wonderful Jesus is, because Jesus is wonderful. But at some point, that's got to be connected to Christians being really honest to say, yeah, he's wonderful, and he's the one who gave us the brand, but we're not who we're called to be. We're off brand, and we're sorry. And I think people can handle that.
Two things. Number one, not kidding, I'll send you a copy. It's not published yet. I think I'm going to publish it. I wrote an article about reclaiming the word evangelical as a positive term for the church. It's called Why I'm Not an Exvangelical.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to publish it. Not 100% sure.
I hope you do.
But you can search my website to see if I actually did it. But yeah, I think it's a positive word that has all of a sudden in the last 20 years, 30 years, taken on such negative connotations. And if you study it historically, it is such a positive, across-the-board word used by people who are widely different, and actually, testifies to the unity of the church, not the division of the church. And now it's become something backwards in America, North America, the West. I would agree with that. Secondly, one advantage Domino's has is a unified corporate franchise structure. So if you're the CEO of Domino's, you get to just say, all right, no more. We're going to tell everybody we suck. We're going to give out free pizza. We're going to remake everything at the franchise level. And haven't had Domino's on, but we've had Cheryl Batchelder from Popeye's Louisiana Kitchen, the total rebrand there. We've had so many turnaround stories on this podcast. And the advantage you have as CEO is, it takes a lot of persuasion, and you get the franchise owners on board and everything, but it's one organization. And the church theologically is one, but I could apologize, you could apologize, we could get tens of thousands of listeners listening to the show to apologize. Meanwhile, you have 250,000 who are like, no, we're not going to do that. What do you do? Because it's such a diverse body. It's I always say to people, there are more good news stories than bad news stories in the headlines, but unfortunately, the headlines don't particularly enjoy the good news stories, so you only hear the bad news stories. Now, do I think we have something to deal with? Yes, I think we have something to deal with. But what do you do when you're not one organization that can just make a top-down or bottom-up change?
Yeah, we talked about that in that meeting.
Okay.
Because we realized, and there were some people there from the National Association, NAE, National Association of Evangelicals too, to say, what is the word? Who speaks for evangelicals? It's such a broad, such a broad word, so how could we possibly do that? And so I think it's a great challenge and a great question. And ultimately, Jesus is the CEO of the church. We're all franchisees of that. And I believe he's doing it. I really, what I see happening right now, and I've been in these conversations because of the book and all these different all these different settings of the spectrum of evangelicalism and Christianity is that there's two things going on at one time. But I think God's bringing correction to his. I think Jesus is bringing correction to his church. But you've got one wing that is doubling down on the culture wars and the us against them, and political, all that stuff, Christian nationalism and take America back, all that stuff, right? So they're feeding on fear, and fear creates either fight or flight, right? So they're doubling down on that, and they're actually growing right now. I mean, that segment of the church is growing because they're feeding on fear. Yeah. But that's like a Rolade boat. It's not gonna last. That version of Christianity is not gonna.
Love that analogy, a Rolade boat.
So it's not gonna pass on to the next generation. Yeah. Which is terrible, which is sad to me, because they're actually doing it because they're afraid because of their kids, and they're actually guaranteeing their kids are not gonna follow Jesus. Most of them. Many of them. Yeah. And so that's I think that's tragic. But on the other side, there's this sort of growing sense, and especially in the younger generations of evangelicals who don't have those same hangups and evidence of mission drift, who are really saying, hey, we've got to get back on brand, so to speak, and we've got a culture to reach, and so I see that happening, and it's sort of a movement of that. And when I think of movement, as I look at the culture, if there's people who are not in the same circle, who are not talking to each other but saying the same thing in the church, to me that's a big clue that the Holy Spirit is at work, and bringing a spirit of correction, and bringing and I see that happening. So I don't know what I can do to do what you said, right? To in evangelicalism, but the encouraging thing to me is I really believe Jesus is doing that in the American church, and I think there's a movement toward that. And so you have all these people writing about it now and coming out with stuff about it now, and I think the conversation's going to change a healthier direction, even though it'll be turbulent over the next 5 years or so.
Yeah. Any other case studies from marketing that you think are particularly poignant for this moment of time we're in?
Yeah, one of them is Johnson & Johnson, and Dwight that we talked about actually is the one that worked with them on this, so that's a fun one. But in 1982 in Chicago, somebody tampered with some boxes of Tylenol.
I remember that.
Yeah, and a girl died almost right away, and then over the next week or so, about 7 other people got sick and died. And as these were laced with cyanide, and so it was this, and so Chicagoland, it wasn't just panic in Chicagoland; it was panic everywhere.
Tylenol got pulled off all the shelves. Didn't it?
Did, yeah. They chose to do that. Yeah, so they, and that was their decision, right? And really, the panic wasn't just about Tylenol. The panic was anything in grocery stores, right? Because everything is tamperable. And what they chose to do, they could have said, well, it's not our fault. We didn't tamper with it. They could have spun it somehow. They could have made all kinds of excuses, but they're the ones who decided to pull it. And not just in Chicago, they pulled it everywhere. It was $100 million worth of Tylenol, which that's in
1982
numbers.
Yeah.
I have no idea what that would be now.
Multiply that by 4 decades.
Basically, we're going to pull it everywhere. And they also went to the drawing board before they put it out. And they're the ones that came up with, triple sealed packaging, right? So you've got the cardboard box and the tape over it. And then inside, over the top, there's a plastic thing that goes over, that you have to break before you can even open the bottle. And then when you open the bottle, there's an internal seal that you have to then pull out. So they went overboard to say, when we say safety is the most important thing to us, we're not kidding. We mean it, right? So much so that we're going to pull $100 million worth of product and destroy it, even though they could have just pulled it in Chicago, right? But they didn't because of that perception. And so for me, it's another example of an organization that was willing to see the problem and own it, not see themselves as victims, not, whatever, but to say, hey, we know we have a problem. It's our problem. We're going to be honest about that. We're going to take responsibility for it, and we're going to double down on our brand so that they became known as the safest, the safest medicine in the world, as opposed to the least safe medicine in the world. And that happened really quickly because they took such a radical step. And so for us, what would it look like to double down on our brand, to be the most radically loving group of people on the planet, to love people in unexpected places and unexpected ways, and for that to be our focus it should be our focus anyway, because that's our brand, but to really double down on that in a world that's so vitriolic and so self-centered. The pandemic could have been that for us. We kind of we whiffed that opportunity. That's another conversation. But I think Johnson & Johnson I think that's a helpful analogy to say, hey, I think if we took it seriously, double down on the brand in a world where people are really hungry for what you can only find in Jesus, I think we too could make a big impact.
So what have you done? Because there's the macro brand, which we've been talking about, but a lot of people who listen to the show, most of them are either involved in a local church, work at a local church, lead a local church. So there's sort of the micro brand of your church, right? And your church has a reputation. It could be like, I didn't even know your church was in the community. That reputation would be indifference or oblivion, to a negative reputation, to a positive reputation. Tell us a little bit about your church and what you've done to try to get on brand with Jesus in your community.
Yeah. So we work really hard to stay externally focused as a church and empower people, where they're at. And there's all kinds of ways that we do that. And to say, how could we be known in the community, and so one of the ways we did that early on, and I'll share some other stuff here in a minute, but
Sure.
is we did, there are campaigns like North Point does, Be Rich, right? That are easy ways for people to engage. But one of the campaigns we did was unexpected. It was unexpected love in unexpected places. And what we did is we empowered people to say, who are the people in our community who think we hate them? And let's go after them with radical love. And so we gave out grants. We gave out money for people to do that individually if they needed it. But then as a church, we chose certain projects. So we know that LGBTQ plus community, right, thinks we hate them. So how are we going to love it? Or felons and criminals think we hate them. So how are we going to go? And so we did some unexpected things that produced buzz in our community. And we came alongside the AIDS Association of Dallas because really the only other people who were involved primarily were LGBT people. And we were the enemy, or they thought, vice versa in their mind. And so they had to vet us before they would even let us, serve and let us engage. Or we tried to bring in the Bail Project and that's a whole other, that became this big controversy. But it did signal something very different in our community and culture. And that was hugely successful. We're very engaged in the community. We have a thing called Local Good Center. We're starting local good coffee shops to connect people to that story of local good. Our invitation has become not so much come to church with us, but come change the world with us. You don't have to be one of us to do that. And we've also hired advertising agencies to help get us to the people that we're trying to get to. Because, Jesus said, let your light shine in such a way that people see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Well, 2,000 years ago, that's pretty easy. If you're living in a little village, you do something good, people walk by. Oh, that's so cool. Do you see what Carey's family did?
Yeah.
But in our culture, how can people actually see good in a way that people who don't know God would actually glorify God they don't know? How would that happen? And we think, well, the best way for people to see is media. And the best the best people to help us do that are not Christians to get to non-Christians, but secular media agencies. And so we actually hired 2 secular media agencies that we work with to help get the story out, because most of our churches are doing tremendous good in our communities, but people don't see it. They don't know it. And so they've been super helpful in getting us to the people that we could not get to otherwise, and making that visible in a way that people can glorify God.
How do you deal with the fact that the church is really a mixed bag? I was having a long conversation with someone yesterday in the church parking lot who I guess read one of my books, recognized me, stopped me as I was just walking to my car, didn't have any role in the service, and we got talking about it, and his trust had been shattered.
Yeah.
He was fairly new to our church and had been through a bunch of life experiences. And I just said before I prayed with him, I'm like, hey, what you need to know is our church is a mixed bag. Like there are untrustworthy people here. There are trustworthy people here. There are, good people here. We're all trying to get better. I'm probably going to let you down at some point. So will others. But we're all doing our best here, trying to get to know Jesus. And we're really, really glad you're here. And what he did after I finished praying for him, he said, the fact that you said we're a mixed bag really increased my trust in this organization. And I said, well, I promise we are going to let you down at some point. So, what do you do? Because that is the reality, right? That we say, and I said to my wife, Tony, she wasn't feeling well, so she wasn't there yesterday. But I said to her, 20 years ago, I think I would have answered different. 20 years ago, I think I would have tried to convince him that we're different than all the other churches and that maybe we're better than all the other churches. And now I'm just like, you know what? I'm a mixed bag. We're all a mixed bag. I think you're going to fit in great here. Yeah. What do you do with that reality, though, when you're marketing? Because inevitably, we're going to disappoint people, right? Inevitably, not everybody who listens to all 600 and some odd episodes thinks everyone is a great one. And some people unsubscribe and they get mad at me or whatever. Yeah. Like that happens. So what do you do in an imperfect world when it comes to branding and making sure that the expectation matches the reality?
Yeah, I love your instincts with your friend, because it's all about authenticity. And I think we can own it. I think it's one of the beauties of the church is how God uses imperfect people to do incredible things, And so, so we talk about all the time, hey, we're a bunch of messes on a mission. And if you're perfect, you're not going to fit in here. And so, but if you're a mess, if you're imperfect, if you're, then that's exactly that's who this collection of people is. And God loves to use messes on a mission. Because I think not take ourselves too seriously, and because my experience, I've done this a long time, is that we as Christians tend to take ourselves too seriously and our mission not seriously enough. And what if we took ourselves not very seriously, but our mission to reach people like your friend really seriously, right? And people can handle authenticity, and they can handle, hey, I'm not perfect and I know it. Just kind of like I said, with my surprise about this book is the most enthusiastic people have been non-Christians who've gotten a hold of it. Because it's a group of Christians talking about, not saying we're so great and we believe in Jesus and we're right and you're wrong and, we've got it going on. Instead, a book where Christians are saying, yeah, we're really screwed up and we're way off. You talk about mission drift. We're like way off, and if we want to get back, it's pulled, I've had more conversations with, again, more positive conversations with non-Christians than any other single group of people. I think they're waiting for that kind of authenticity. I think they're hungry for it.
Yeah. You mentioned the LGBTQ community. We've had a number of leaders on speaking into that.
Yeah.
What do you find, and again, if this is an appropriate question, we can cut it, but some churches are affirming, many churches are not affirming. Is that a deal breaker in building strong relationships with the LGBTQ plus community?
I don't think so. I hope not. And let's go from, I think Jesus is the best model for that. Because he was a friend of sinners, right? And I know, and so he had the widest of welcomes of any other person in his culture. But welcome doesn't mean agreement or, that kind of thing. And so, I think he's a great, the way I think about Jesus's way of relating to people is he had a wide welcome to a narrow path. And And so a lot of times when we're talking about radical love and all that, Christians get really nervous saying, well, you're just talking about throwing away truth and there is no path. And that's not what we're
Right.
saying at all. That's not loving, right? To say, hey, there is actually a path that leads to goodness and righteousness and, good things. We're just not going to talk about it. But it's a wide welcome to a narrow path. And so for us, we're a church in the Dallas area we're not affirming theologically, but we're known to be very welcoming. And so for us, that wide welcome to a narrow path means, hey, we don't hide the fact that we believe Jesus affirms sex and marriage between a man and a woman. But at the same time, you can be here, you can serve here, and never agree with that. That's okay. We're always going to affirm what Jesus affirms because we love you enough to do that. And for all of us, we're all trying to come around what Jesus affirms in all areas of our life. And we just invite you to come open to whatever Jesus would affirm. We're going to do our best. We could be wrong. There are good people who disagree. And we're going to always point to what he affirms, but we're going to give loads of time and patience in the process. And I like Henry Cloud. I think his formula for spiritual growth is grace plus truth over time. So you lead with grace. You do over time point to truth, but that time is so important. And on this issue, Christians just give no time. It's like, oh, you got to agree or else, or you can't be here. And that's not the way
table
Jesus...
stakes, right?
Yeah.
Initial question, not...
Yeah. And that's not the way Jesus
question.
related.
Yeah.
And so we have more than our normal share of LGBTQ plus people in our church because we're known for that, which makes Christians nervous, which we're fine with. Just like Jesus, that friend of sinners or whatever. And it's not. Please understand. I know it's not a sin to be gay or to be, to have gender dysphoria and that kind of stuff, right? Just how you handle that. But we've had a lot of friendly fire in the Dallas area for that, and we're fine with that because we think that's exactly the way Jesus would relate. And so he was a welcoming but not affirming person for a whole lot of issues and a whole lot of different things. And I think he models that pretty well.
Yeah, if listeners want to drill down deeper on that, I had a really good conversation with Kevin Palau, episode 613, where we went deep into that issue about some of those tensions that we just described right now. Okay, one or two more questions for you. I imagine there's, we tend to be optimistic as church leaders, and self-perception is always an issue for all of us. There might be some people listening going, we have a pretty good reputation in the community, I'm pretty sure, only to find out if they actually did the hard work that it's not true. So short of hiring an expert marketer to run a net promoter score, how do you assess what your reputation or standing in the community might actually be? Are there any reasonably accurate ways to get a sense of what people think of your church or organization in the community?
Yeah, I think Mike and Dwight, would say the best thing you can do is ask, and there are ways to do that, and so, like I remember years ago, we changed our church name. We used to be called Fellowship Bible Church North. That's a handful, and there's a lot of trigger words in there. And so now we're just Chase Oaks Church because it's the neighborhood that our main campus is in, and we could brand it completely. But I can't say the name because there's some churches with this name out there. So I really liked it. I thought it was an incredible name. It expressed our vision and mission. And so Mike, on our team said, hey, that's great, and you think everybody will love it, especially non-church people. Let's ask. And so we did one of those things where we went to, in that case, it was a Chick-fil-A. Now, that was 20 years ago. Now it'd probably be too Christian. And we said, hey, we'll give you free Chick-fil-A if you just do this short thing. And we looked at, 5 different names. And my name got crucified. People
you
were
mean
like,
your candidate?
Yeah, people
your
who don't,
candidate.
because we asked, do you go to church? No, and all that. And okay, if you don't go to church, then those are the people we count. We didn't count church people with our name. And they were like, we don't know what that is. That doesn't make any sense. What is that? Is that a hospital? Is that with this particular name? And it got shamed out of existence very quickly. But I believed it would have been perfect. And so we did that for 2 Saturdays. And really, I mean, you could do the same thing and just ask people, hey, when you think of Christianity, what do you think of? When you think of this church, what do you think of? And people love talking. Like they will do it. They will tell you. And even something as simple as that, without trying to convince them or, oh no, that's not who we are. All you're doing is just finding the information. And again, people love doing that stuff.
Would you do that with the senior pastor leading the conversation?
No.
No, I'm thinking nobody wants to tell you your baby's ugly, right?
Yeah,
so they'll be like,
right.
oh no, we think your church is awesome.
Yeah.
So who would you get? What kind of neutral or objective facilitator would you get?
Yeah, most of us have marketing people in our church who've done 50 of those. And they've probably wondered why your church has never done anything like that, So,
right.
So all we did is get people like Mike and others to say, hey, would you design a process where we could get feedback from the people that are our target market and that we could get honest feedback? And it honestly didn't take them very long to say, oh yeah, we'll do that, And so it's tricky for us, but not tricky for people who do that every day.
Anything else we haven't covered that you think we should cover before we wrap up?
Yeah, one of the concerns I have right now as I'm talking to Christians really broadly and churches really broadly with this project is that with the kinds of churches that listen to your podcast, especially, there's a real gap of nuance about issues like politics and culture and our identity as Christians and how we engage. There's this huge gap between the pastor, the level of nuance there, and the staff and the church and the congregation. And the reason is because it's really difficult to push into that stuff. And a lot of our churches, we just want to evangelize. We just want to share Christ. We just want to teach. We don't want to talk about that. We don't, we're not political. We don't. But there are people talking about it, and they're the wrong people. And so our churches are ideologically driven, not biblically driven, our people. And nobody's really, the only people who are speaking are at the extremes. And that's all people are hearing. And people like us who are not at the extremes aren't talking. And I can relate to that. I mean, I understand that. But if we don't close the gap, then we're never going to solve the problem. And so I think it's a major discipleship issue that we're going to have to speak to. We're going to have to challenge ideology that's in the fear and all that's animating evangelical Christians in our churches. We're going to have to be willing to push into that and close the gap. And there are tools that are, we want to come out. We're in the process of developing some tools to do that. People have used the book that way. I've had pastors at pastors' conferences come up and tell me, hey, thank you for writing a book because you're like the bad guy. Like all I do, I've just had my leaders read your book and they get mad at you. They're like, well, I can't believe he said that, or I can't believe he thinks that about Trump, or I can't believe he thinks that about whatever. And he said, all I have to do, he said, I agree with you. I don't act like, I just say, you know what, man, okay, Jeff, yeah, he kind of went a little crazy there, but what do you think he is saying? Like, is there something there that he said, we actually get exactly where you'd want us to get to, but you're like the bad cop, I'm the good cop. And so we can have the conversation, but I'm not the one saying, well, Pastor Whatever said this. I'm not the one doing that. We're just reading your book and talking about it. And there's some, and we want some more tools to come out. I just saw that, I think it's called the After Party.
I don't know that. Yeah, is that a movie or what is that?
Is coming out. It's actually It's actually a curriculum, as I understand it. I haven't been able to see it yet. That's coming out to help churches improve their political engagement. David French and who's the Christianity Today editor that was kicked out?
Oh,
of the
Russell
Southern
Moore.
Baptist? Yeah, Russell Moore, David French are doing it, and which I think means it's going to be pretty great.
Mm.
And it's a 6-week, from what I understand, a 6-week small group conversation to recapture our sense of identity as Christians and our political engagement as we enter into this season. And all I'm saying is, if we don't do something like that, I think the damage to Christianity is going to continue to be done. And as I wrote the book and we did a series as a church and pushed into this stuff, I thought we'd have this mass exodus. And we kind of already had an exodus in COVID with some of that. But what I got was not that at all. It was very galvanizing for our church. And the most common thing I heard people say is, thank you so much for speaking strongly from the middle, because nobody's speaking strongly from the middle. You have people speaking strongly from the extremes. And I knew that even though some of the extremes it's like, well, that kind of sounds right, but there's something not right. And for somebody just to name it in a more nuanced position and a middle position gives me confidence to not bump over there or bump over to the other side. Just thank you. Because there's just not enough of that part of the conversation out there. And so that's the other thing I'd say is I don't think we're at a place where we can not talk about some things that we're pretty comfortable not talking about.
I think that I want to underscore that. I think that's really important, particularly in a year like 2024. And I think you're right. We have a lot of nuanced people listening to this podcast. We have a pretty wide tent, but like a lot of nuanced thinkers. And that's exactly the argument that's been on my mind this year, which is that a lot of the people who might not be at either extreme are now they feel silenced by this environment. Oh, if I say something, and it's funny, you mentioned, people read the book. It's like, oh, you're the bad guy. That's one of my favorite pieces of content or feedback I get from leaders if they're reading a book or dissecting a podcast or resource I create or an article I wrote. It's like, oh yeah, my board was all over the place on it, but like I just put you up there, you're the bad guy, and then we get to a better place as a result. I'm like, that's a win, man. That's a win. And we need more voices sort of that are not one of the crazy extremes speaking, particularly at a time like this. Well, the book is called Rebranding Christianity. Jeff, where are you findable online these days?
Yeah, go to rebrandingchristianity.org. And the book's on Amazon. There's some bookstores too, but Amazon's the easiest way. But rebrandingchristianity.org is a growing body of work of resources that'll be out there, as well as there's a Rebranding Christianity podcast where we interview kind of middle people. We interview nuanced people and who are doing either thinkers or people doing incredible work. And it's challenging. We don't agree. I mean, it's not necessarily just people that agree with us. That's not the point. But in fact, we want to sort of model disagreeing well in a world where we're kind of losing that ability and not just being in our own little reinforcing bubble. So yeah, rebrandingchristianity.org is the best place to go.
Great. Jeff, this has been a delight. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Carey.